Boban Dedović, and this is episode 5 of the What We Talk About When We Talk About Mind podcast. I have a very special guest today named Peihan Huo. He's currently a PhD student at Cornell University, and his research is focused on applied mathematics, that is to say, in modeling, game theory, and finance. He graduated with honors from Brown University with a bachelor's degree in applied mathematics as well. He's also a native speaker of one of several Chinese languages and has sufficient command of the English language as well. I'm excited to discuss with him what he talks about when he talks about mind. For today's hat, we have a cuneiform symbol that's known in Sumerian as the shag symbol. And as you can see, we have a few wedge-shaped marks enclosing a little X, which is also represented by 2 more wedges. Because this writing system, cuneiform, was used in both Sumerian and Akkadian, among other languages, there's some overlap with the word. As noted, in Sumerian, this symbol meant shag, which is also translated as heart or mind, or usually center, midst. In Akkadian, the word is libbum, and libbum also means heart. It comes to be translated as mind, and it's another one of these thorny ancient language words that we're so interested in. Again, that's the hat of the day. It's the shag symbol in both Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform. And for today's book, we have Your Brain is a Time Machine, The Neuroscience and Physics of Time by Dean Buonomano. It was published in 2017 and explains all the different unique ways that your body tracks time and keeps up your homeostasis. The last few chapters are very interesting with respect to language. After all, this book has to be written, and the last few chapters talk a lot about personhood, what it means to perceive time, and how that's explained to other people versus how it maybe stands with physicists or other trained professionals. And I recommend the book for that reason. That is to say, the last few chapters of the book talk about how time is such an important concept in language, and we have to talk about it in terms of space. And we're very limited by what our language can afford, which of course is indicative of the tight relationship between language and psychology. So the book is called Your Brain is a Time Machine, The Neuroscience and Physics of Time by Dean Buonomano, and I highly recommend it. So tell me a little bit about your linguistic background. What's your native language and how did English come into the fold?
So my native language is Mandarin Chinese. So the written language is simplified Chinese. Because in mainland China, we have English classes. So it's basically part of the requirement since elementary school. And also it's part of the exam requirements. For me personally, middle school and high school, I went to it's still a public school, but the curriculum focused a lot more on English and foreign languages. So some of my classmates, they do like French and Spanish. I just did English. So, and also I came here to the States for college. So that's how I pick up more like English, like conversational English. And so now I've been here for like 6 years now. Yeah. And I've been conversing with people in English. And I think I'm pretty fluent in English right now.
Yeah, I'd say you're very fluent. I remember when we were having an earlier discussion, and I noticed how with your background being in applied mathematics, you're very particular and you're very good about the numbering in your words. And when I say numbering, I mean applying the correct quantity, such as dog, one dog versus dogs or multiple. For example, I recall you're very specific about saying maths, matrix, matrices, vertex, vertices, so forth. So I think many people would agree that you're much more than fluent in English. But
thank you. Yeah.
Your native language is Mandarin Chinese, but the writing system you said is simplified Chinese, correct?
Yeah.
The first time I heard the process of learning the characters and how that needs to happen at a specific window of time. I was pretty fascinated by it. And this was from a different friend whom I spoke with several years ago. But could you share a little more detail about what it's like to go through that process to learn that language as well as the writing system?
Chinese, like Mandarin, is probably like commonly agreed as one of the hardest language for foreigners to pick up, because it's completely a different language system. The words, the characters, they don't based on like what we have in English, like the fixed alphabets, right? In Chinese, we have distinct characters to have certain meaning. Unlike English, where you just piece alphabets together to get a word, Chinese, you piece different characters together to get phrases. But each character are unique and has their own meaning, right? So that's the challenging part about the language. So you have to be in the language environment because you have to hear people talking, right? You have to listen to how people phrase their sentences. Because in Chinese, a lot of times there's no fixed grammatical structure to a sentence, especially in conversational setting. There's absolutely no one fixed way to express what you want to say. Unlike in English, because in English it's pretty standard sentence structure. You either have subject, object, and the verb. But in Chinese, people easily flip subjects. They easily omit subjects or objects. A lot of times it depends on the context. So I think that's what makes the language even harder, because there's no fixed grammatical structure. And in being able to understand Chinese, you have to understand everything, or mostly everything, in the context. Right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to identify like who's the subject and who's the object, because many times it's omitted, especially the spoken language. So for me, I think it's just that I grew up in an environment that my parents, everyone around me, speak Chinese. So it's like, in terms of speaking part, it's not that challenging, because as a kid, I just learned how to speak Chinese. And then the characters are a little bit more challenging because, like I said, there are thousands of characters in Chinese, and we use about like 2,000 to 3,000 characters on daily basis. So in order to, basically what that means is, like, if you want to understand what's going on in your life, if you go to grocery, or just live a daily life, you would need to know around like 2,000 characters. And then if you want to do work, some jobs, if you want to be more formal, if you're like a lawyer, then you would have to know more characters, because some words and phrases and idioms are commonly very, very commonly used in Chinese. So you have to know these formal phrases and idioms, and there's a lot of like implied meanings in Chinese. Chinese people tend to be a lot more implicit. They're not that outspoken. Sometimes it's what they say, you have to read between the lines. So thankfully, I mean, after the government simplified Chinese, they also, because they want to promote the literacy rate, so they also introduce what we call the pinyin. So it's like how you can pronounce the characters. It's an easier way to pronounce the characters. So part of the elementary school curriculum in China is also about learning this new pronunciation system, pinyin. So that's briefly how I learned Chinese.
And at what age did you first start learning English? Because I know you said a moment ago that it was required curriculum to study other foreign languages in school, correct?
Yeah, so the official curriculum starts in just first grade in elementary school. But nowadays, people of my generation or younger, we already started learning English in kindergarten, like when we were like 4 or 5 years old. Nowadays, it's even more competitive. Parents sign their kids up for like English classes just to get a head start, because the overall environment in China is very competitive.
I also had to learn English between the ages of 6 and 9 years old while I was still developing another language. And I found this very problematic, and it was difficult. My parents had to choose a dominant language. Otherwise, I would stutter if I wasn't sure how to respond. Did you ever have some of these developmental challenges, or are you aware of any developmental challenges of learning two languages simultaneously during a critical period?
Yeah, I think there are definitely lots of challenges, especially when I first started learning English. Like I said, I think there are two completely different language systems. So when first starting, it was hard for me to learn the pronunciation of the English words. And it's hard to, because I wasn't in the English language environment. No one around me actually speaks English. So it's kind of hard to learn how to speak, right? And how to pronounce certain words. So it's kind of interesting because I mentioned pinyin, right? Like how you pronounce the Chinese characters. For convenience, they specifically use the English alphabets in pinyin. So when I first started learning English, actually it's pretty common among many Chinese people. We just use the way how we pronounce pinyin to pronounce English words, and that's completely off. So it's kind of funny because we have a term called Chinglish, and it's kind of referring to the specific method of pronouncing English words using the same way as how we pronounce like the Chinese characters. So that's kind of I for a period of time I did that as well. Then later on I began to learn like more of the correct pronunciations and kind of being able to separate the two languages.
That's very interesting. I'd never heard of the phrase Chinglish. I'll have to look it up and see if it qualifies as an ISO recognized language. Now, I'm interested a little bit more about the comment you said a second ago concerning the differences between the language systems of English and Chinese. Could you talk a little bit about what some of the major differences are?
Right. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, I think grammatically speaking, like I said, in English, there's more distinct structures in the language, especially in the written language. There's nothing much you can do. It is if you speak like Master Yoda, you sound very weird to people, right? And but in Chinese, everyone speaks like Master Yoda. And then sometimes people just give a phrase like "eat," but they put in like a questioning sense, and then maybe they feel like there's not enough information for the receiver to understand what's going on, so they add something after that single phrase or word, and so it's kind of like everything gets pieced together in like not in very clear order, but somehow people are able to understand. And as for like written language, there are in Chinese I mean, of course, for written language, there's slightly more structure to it, but since there are so many characters and so many different ways to combine those characters, you can create new phrases just by like, combining, rearranging the different characters. And sometimes in written language, it can also have more variety than English. In terms of the more of the meaning or the subtleties, English words tends to be more straightforward. Like one word just means a particular thing. Like, of course, if you want to trace the etymology, there are history behind certain words, but basically what I'm trying to say is like ignorance of those history of the English word doesn't really prevent you from using the word correctly, because the word is just has the specific meaning, and if you use that, people will be able to understand. In comparison, in Chinese, there's a lot more subtleties. I mean, of course, this is part of due to the long lasting history of China. They have 4,000, 5,000 years of history, and mostly people keep the same language system, right? And so in Chinese, you have multiple words can mean the same thing, but they're commonly used in very different settings. So if a people is well educated, they would know the history of a certain phrase, especially idioms. Like for idioms, there's a lot more history to it, and usually they are coined by some like really famous people in history, or like referring to a particular really well-known event in history. So sometimes they have very different connotations. Some of them have negative, and some of them have positive connotations. So if you're not well educated enough and you just use certain words, it can cause you big trouble, because other people will be able to understand the implications. So I think this is also kind of unique to the Chinese language. Lots of implications are used. So like I said before, you have to read between lines. You have to understand what's the hidden meaning behind the obvious words and phrases.
You mentioned before that there were a lot of implicit phrases, and you've doubled down on it now by saying that in English, things can be a lot more, or things are usually a lot more explicit. So could you give me an example of one of these phrases that requires context, but maybe could have many hidden meanings? And anyone will suffice, just because I think a lot of people are curious for what it's like to encounter one of these from a listener's perspective.
So I think a very obvious example is lots of Chinese people are very good at being sarcastic. So it's not just, it's the same word, but if you just use a different tone, it could mean like very different things. For example, it's kind of fun. It's this anecdote that I recently just heard from a friend at Cornell. So their office was located in the basement of their, they're in the chemical engineering department. So they're, one of the students' office is located in the basement. So they were complaining about how their office is in the basement and there's no window, etc. And the other student, which is the friend of mine, got tired of listening to the complaints. So they just said, the literal translation is foundation, but they said it in a way that it sounds very sarcastic. They were basically saying, you are so important. They were saying to the other person who were complaining, like, you're so important, like you don't deserve to be in the basement.
Oh, I gotcha. I see what you're saying. And what is the phrase in Chinese?
基石. So basically the word by word translation, 基 means foundation and 石 means stone. So it's basically just the bedrock.
Perfect. Yeah, that is an interesting way. So would that be used as a way to make a comment about someone in playful antagonism?
Yeah, so I think that was exactly what happened. There are countless examples. It's so basically any word in Chinese, if you say it in like a particular context, it could mean very different things. For example, the word I just mentioned, people seldom use that. They only use that when it comes to like, when it sort of comes to like quote unquote propaganda related stuff. Like they're saying something is so important that it's the foundation to the country, but we seldom use that in daily setting. So when you say it like in like a daily conversation setting, like when you say, oh, you're the foundation of this department, then it definitely sounds very sarcastic.
Absolutely. And there's a fine line between some of these terms, such as sarcasm, idioms, and there's many others, of course, like hyperbole, simile, and so forth. But the book I just introduced yesterday was called The Grammar of Metaphor, for the fourth interview that I did with Dr. Brian McVeigh. I remember the book classified some of these, and I think the classification, the one you just shared, would be amplification. That is to say, the phrase is said in order to bring attention to some particular aspect of a situation, so it amplifies it. So one thing that I'm very interested to discuss is the word mind as it relates to some of their potential Chinese counterparts. And I say this with a high level of interest and enthusiasm because when I looked online, I found so many of these words. And what I'd like to do is go through them one by one, and I can spell them out using the pinyin system. I'm not going to make an attempt to pronounce any of them, and I'm hoping to rely on you for that. And I'm hoping with each term, moreover, you can tell us how it's pronounced, as well as how it's used according to your daily life. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, sure.
So the first one I have is spelled Tounao.
It's pronounced as 头脑.
Yes.
So TOU part is 头, so that means the literal head. And the second part is 脑. I think the literal translation is brain. So referring to the what's inside the skull, right? And together it means intelligence. Like if you say someone has 头脑, then it means they're intelligent and they're very smart and sharp.
So this word, is it ever used in a way to describe physical separation between a person and the word?
We could say 没头脑. 没 means no. So basically, the literal translation is just no brain. Like, but it's usually used in a more jocular setting. Like people are being trying to make fun of someone, but in a friendly way, not in like a really like antagonistic way. But formally, I don't think this is commonly used. So it's more commonly used in like a daily colloquial language setting. We say 没头脑.
So first one on the list.
Right. So the second one we already talked about, the 头脑. So the first one, it's pronounced as 心神. So this is more referring to the state of mind. So there's actually this idiom called 心神不宁. So the first 心神 is state of mind, and 不 is no, 宁 is peaceful. So the literal translation is that you are not in a peaceful state of mind. It describes this anxious state of anxiety and people feeling really on edge. So and it's the 心神 is more referring to like a feeling, and the most common way people use that is the phrase or the idiom that I just mentioned, 心神不宁. It's very rarely used on its own. So mostly it's used in that particular phrase.
And we already covered the second one. What about the third one? So the third word, sometimes in English, we get it as spirit, mind, essence, psyche, vitality, or vigor. And this one really caught my mind. How is it pronounced?
So the second character, as you can see, is the same as the second character in the first word phrase, right? So it's together is pronounced as 精神. So the first one is 精, and second character is 神. So yeah, so like you said, the translation would be spirit. So it also describes like you look. So there are different ways you can use this word. It can be an adjective. So you could say you look very 精神, means you look very energetic. You're basically shining. And there's this like very popular phrase on the internet, says 精神小伙. So it means it's very energetic guy. So just a very enthusiastic guy. So people use this quite often. And so that's where when you use it as an adjective. You can also use this as a noun, which basically means spirit, right? So you could say you're not in a good mood or you don't look well. So you could say 精神不好. 不 is no and 好 is good. So it basically means spirit no good. So like it's not about your physical, well, definitely your physical appearance gives hints, but it's more about like how you present yourself. Like sometimes you just look very depressed and sad and people say you don't have a good spirit, right? 精神.
Is it appropriate for me to say that, for me to consider it or think about it as something which animates a person, or something that which gives a person something that enables people to move and to carry themselves in a social interaction? Do you think that's an appropriate characterization?
Yeah, so actually in the traditional Chinese culture, people emphasize on three things. It's the 精, qi, and shen. So here it's 精神, right? 精 and shen. But there's actually another character which people sometimes put in between those two, is called qi. Qi is the literal translation is breath, but it's more referring to the inner flow in your body, like because in the traditional Chinese medicine, Jing is the sort of like, they're all referring to what's going on in your body, but kind of these three things dominates like your well-being. So if you can't lose any of those three things. If you lose one of those three, you won't look energetic. You won't look very good.
Could you just repeat what the three words are? I'm very interested.
Right. So it's the Jing, which is the first character in this word, and Qi is like the literal translation is breath, and Shen is spirit, or another meaning is God. So that's the last character in this word. So it's three things: Jing, Qi, and Shen.
I encounter words like this that have these variable meanings quite often. It's interesting because it's a very multifaceted word, and even more impressive that you use it as an adjective, as in vigorous, lively, animated, and so forth. And really, it gives more credence to what you said earlier about the versatility of the language and the writing system, and the absolute necessity to consider the context in which the word is used. And what about the fourth word on that list that might commonly be read as attention?
Right. So this one is a little bit more distinct from the rest, because this one just means pay attention. Right. So 注, it's pronounced as 注意. So 注 means the literal translation is instill. So you, or give. And yi is your well, I guess yi kind of, you can translate it that as attention or mind. So the literal translation of this phrase or this word means give attention or give mind. I think yi is because when we talk about the Chinese word for consciousness is 意识. So yi is the 意识 means attention and knowledge. So 意识 together means consciousness. So that's kind of interesting because it's sort of encapsulates like Chinese people's understanding of what consciousness is.
I find as we go through these, they're interesting, they overlap. I think interpreting these is going to be a psycholinguistic task, a very significant psycholinguistic chore from someone in several hundred years. So I'm happy we're documenting this right now because I think it's important. Also, I think it's important because this isn't work that a lot of other people are doing, and people aren't really having conversations about some of these very important words that we use on a daily basis. So what about the fifth one on the list that I see is translated as either mind or heart?
Yeah, so for this one, it's pronounced as 胸怀. So Xiong literally means the chest or breast, right? So that's what Xiong means. And Huai is also referring to this specific part. When you say when in Chinese, when we say hug, it means 怀抱, like if you just hug someone, or that's 怀. So actually these two characters, they all mean to this physical part of the chest part of the human body, and together it usually means it could mean your aspiration, your goal, or it could also mean your tolerance, like your ability to tolerate or bear like certain unfairness or people mistreating you, or just, yeah. So it could it's kind of the combination of like ambition and being able to tolerate.
And what about this sixth one? It's mind or breadth of mind, breadth.
Right. So this is pronounced as 胸襟. So 胸, same character. It means the chest part, and 襟 is actually the collar, like what the ancient Chinese people wear, like the traditional Chinese garment. Like they have a special collar. So this means the chest and collar. That's the literal translation. And what that means is this one is more referring to like you being able to tolerate, like, because people in Chinese culture, people really value like someone is good at tolerating like unfairness or mistreatment, because back in the days, like if you get some mistreatment or from the emperor, then you have to hold it, or if you get unfair treatment from your peers or your boss, right? Now someone superior than you have to be able to tolerate and move on, sort of.
Is this word predominantly used in accompaniment with other people or the actions of another person, or is it used in a single person capacity? And by single person, I mean, I get up, I'm not having the best day, and I'm at risk of losing my composure, getting emotional. I'm not sure if that question makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I think it makes sense. So I think it's less commonly used in like a personal level. Like if you wake up and you just have a bad mood, we seldomly use this particular phrase. So it refers to something, bigger issues, like when you get mistreated or like when you get oppressed by your superior. It's seldomly used on like a personal level. And it's seldomly used in a daily conversational setting. Again, like if you want to be sarcastic, you could use this. Yeah.
What would be a sarcastic way to use the phrase? An example?
You could say you really have 胸襟, like, which means that if you feel bad for that person, like the mistreatment they're getting, like, but they still somehow like tolerate that, you could say, you really have 胸襟, like it's a little bit being a little bit sarcastic. It's kind of criticizing that particular person being too weak.
I understand if they take it personal. So it sounds like, just based on what we've covered so far, it sounds like a lot of these are, number one, anatomical references to the chest, to the heart, and to the trunk of the body. And number two, it sounds like there's not a clear line or not a clear distinction between what's an emotion versus what might be thinking action, if such a line exists at all. But would you agree that it's fair to say that it's hard to differentiate between what's an emotion and what's thinking action?
Yeah, I agree. Yes.
Outside of the words that we covered, are there any other words or expressions or idioms that you think might sound queer to an native English speaker, but do you think were much more commonplace and well understood in your language?
Are you asking about like specifically mind related words?
Yeah, anything related, any permutation or derivation that uses one of the words either we covered or maybe ones that we haven't covered.
When we talk about, if you talk about like a murder or like a really cruel act by someone, you could say they basically lose their heart. So we say 丧心病狂. It's used to describe people who are really obnoxious and who are basically merciless and very cruel. So you could say 丧心病狂. It's like crazy and obnoxious. And also another phrase or idiom used in Chinese is called 失魂落魄. So in Chinese, there's this specific construct where this is your physical body, like your corpse, like your body is your physical container, and inside there's what we call the two things, like 魂 and 魄. I think we talked about this last summer. So the two things together, they compose, or they make up the human spirit. Because in Chinese culture, I think when people die, we believe that your spirit just leaves your body, and your spirit is made up of what we call 魂 and 魄. So the idiom 失魂落魄 means, oh, actually, if you take the the first character and the third character, it's 失落, right? So we talk about this as the falling hope. Yeah.
Disappointment.
Right. So, and then now you insert 魂 and 魄 in there, like make it 失魂落魄. So it's basically just a combinatorics game, right? You have 失落 and you have 魂魄, and then you just insert them into each other, and you get this new idiom. It means you're very depressed, you're very disappointed, and you basically, literal meaning is you lose your spirit. So as if you're dead. So I think in some sense, like 魂魄 refers to more like the subconsciousness. Like you don't have like active control of what's going on, but still it reflects your spirit. So when you look bad and when you look sad, people say you look 失魂落魄, or lose. In a more conversational setting, people would say 丢了魂. Like it basically just lose your spirit. You lost your spirit.
I was always interested about that because there's a huge problem, especially in scholarship when you're studying any language, that the Western mentality and that the Western way of looking at things is the de facto standard worldwide. But as you well know, this is just simply an untrue statement. And it's hard to explain this to some people when they're so immersed in their own psychology as individuals, but on a secondary basis in what a great sociologist called our own collective representations, or that is to say, the collective worldviews of our own society and that society imposes on us, because it can be quite different for different groups of people. Now,
yes,
I wanted to ask a little bit more about any expressions that are related to thinking or decision making. So, for example, in English, we have the phrase, what does your gut tell you, or follow your gut instinct, or follow your heart. Are there any literal expressions that don't necessarily have to be similar to this or exactly to this, but that are uniquely Chinese in how to express decision making, especially in a moment where something has to be done? Are there any phrases that come to mind?
yeah, when it comes to decision making, like you could say, 灵光, it's more related to like when an idea came to you. So you could say 灵光一现 or 灵光乍现. It basically just means like light, some spiritual light hit you, and you just have this sort of unique or brilliant idea, right? And yeah, so I think heart is also sort of the main organ for decision making in Chinese language. People say follow your heart. That's basically mean in Chinese it's 从心. 从 means follow and heart is 心. 心 is heart. Yeah, so I think mainly there's nothing that unique that I can think of at the moment. But of course, the more modern language tend to focus on the brain part a lot more. So people in Chinese, like people also say use your brain, or at least refer to brain when they were talking about decision making.
I have an interesting question for you. Something that I've noticed when I've studied different languages, I call it the mind-heart dichotomy, and I find it quite often because you have to look at the words from an anatomical standpoint. Number one, are we talking about specific organs, or as the neuroscientists like to say, anatomical concomitants? Past that, there's also the distinction between what people believe and what's reflected in their speech. So something that I've noticed is that when we talk about our heart, we tend to think of it as something as we follow, something that acts almost independently of us. However, when we use the word mind or equivalents to the brain and so forth, we tend to treat it as a tool or as some sort of fallible instrument. And I know this sounds a bit strange, but hear me out. When we use the word mind in English, we may say, put your mind to it, or use your mind, or use your brain, or use your head. You notice the verb, it's a verb of utility, to use, or something that's treated like a machine. But now replace those same phrases with heart, and it doesn't quite sound as similar. So for example, we don't say use your heart. We say somebody's heartless, but the heart kind of does its own thing. So I'm wondering what your opinion is on this dichotomy between both anatomy and the way in which we regard the brain as a tool versus the heart as just an inescapable aspect of us that functions almost independently.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I do agree with you. Even I think Chinese is also what's happening in Chinese is also support your claim. So when we mention the brain, it's more about being able to make smart decisions and rational. So it's more related to like rational decisions. But people never say, so, when it comes to like a life-changing decision, or when it comes to like if you are to make a confession or not, or like when it comes to making an honest decision, we always use phrases that are related to heart. So I think that's the main difference. So whenever we mention brain, it's more like we're trying to make a smart and rational decision. But if we want to make honest and true decisions, true to your heart decisions, then heart is inevitably used. And it seems that there is a clear boundary between heart and brain, like, because oftentimes they're used in like very different context in Chinese.
I enjoyed this part of the conversation where we're reflecting on the way words are used and the importance of context, because as I study ancient languages, I'm given a dictionary that I have to look up words, and I've been arguing for some time, and I'm writing about this right now, that I think it's necessary for dictionaries to always supply context. the circumstances under which the word inherits that specific meaning, because for some of these words and the variability they have, I think it's reasonable to assess that it's just too difficult to guess, especially when you're removed in terms of, with respect, it's even more difficult when you're removed with respect to time, space, and language and culture from what you're trying to interpret. So I think that's incredibly important. Peihan, it was really nice to have you on the program and for you to share about some of the interesting words that in Chinese resemble notions of heart and mind, as well as some of the idiomatic expressions that we find ourselves. I really appreciate you for coming on the program.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was also a very sparkling conversation. So I think it definitely, also made me think about a lot of like these idioms and phrases, what they really mean in Chinese. So thank you.